Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our live stream interview with James Alison. I'm Dr. Marian Diaz, the director of Wisdom Ways Center for Spirituality. Wisdom Way Center for Spirituality is a ministry sponsored by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, the St. Paul province. We have been a center for spirituality since 1994, and we're really excited to continue this ministry and to have you with us this evening. We really would like to invite you to, of course, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are, I think, at around 950, so we're really excited to get to 1,000 soon. And if you can help us just bump up that number a bit, that would be wonderful. So while you're with us for this live chat, we invite you to, if you are logged in to an account, you'll be able to add a question or a comment in the chat. Happily, James and I are not exactly alone in the studio today. We have Carly Swenson, the communications strategist, watching the chat for us. And as always, Mike Cabay, our great media person, is here supporting us. And Ellie from St. Kate's, our new amazing intern, is here as well. So a lot of people will be able to help you engage with the content. I hope that this is really interesting for all of you. I'm just very happy to have James here with us and really hoping to explore some of his story and the implications for ministry of his work. So as I begin, I would like to read for you. This is a longer bio, which actually comes from his website, and we'll certainly link that for you in the description below. And if you're watching this later, you can go in and head and check that. James Alison is a Catholic theologian, priest, and author. He has studied, lived, and worked in Mexico, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Spain, and the United States, as well as his native England. James earned his doctorate in theology from the Jesuit faculty in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, in 1994, and is a systematic theologian by training. His principal claim to fame is as one of those who has done most to bring the work of the great French thinker René Girard to a wider public. In addition, he is known for his firm but patient insistence on truthfulness in matters gay as an ordinary part of basic Christianity, and for his pastoral outreach in the same sphere. James was brought up in an evangelical Anglican family and became Catholic at the age of 18 in 1978. He was ordained a priest in 1998. Having lived with the Dominican order between 1981 and 1995, James now works as an itinerant preacher, lecturer, and retreat giver. His books have been translated into Dutch, Italian, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. James' most recent work from 2013 is Jesus the Forgiving Victim, a program of induction into the Christian faith for adults, available in DVD, text, or digital formats, which follows on from the insight into desire associated with the work of René Girard. And this text has been fully translated into French and Welsh. I will say also that when not on the road, James lives in Madrid, Spain. So very excited to have you with us here and just welcome you. James is in Minnesota, spending some time doing some work for a variety of organizations, and we're really happy to have this opportunity. So as I was preparing for this interview, I did watch some other YouTube videos and listen to some podcasts. And I have to start with a really, really important question, because I was watching one of your YouTube live streams, which I believe you were in your flat in Madrid, and I heard a dog lapping water in the background of and I thought, I need to know about that dog and
Nicholas
that creature.
Nicholas the French Bulldog.
Nicholas the French Bulldog.
Nicholas has
Okay.
been known to snore at my homilies.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Yes. Nicholas the French Bulldog makes surprise appearances in many.
And how old is Nicholas?
Nicholas the French Bulldog was 10 last Sunday.
Oh.
Which is really quite old for a French Bulldog.
Yeah.
But he's very sprite and infantile in his behaviour, so I hope that we'll have him for many years longer. But no, he's amazing, and they're famously a breed that has breathing difficulties and
yes.
amazingly,
and quite a popular breed in the States. In fact, they're becoming more and more popular in the States.
Extraordinary dog.
Okay, well, for those of us who love our pets and our creatures, I wanted to just
I am in Minnesota,
make
thousands of miles away, missing Nicholas the French Bulldog.
Missing Nicholas. Okay, so we'll bring his presence here with us today and his spirit. So as I was reading your bio, and for the people who are listening, and especially for those of us who are Catholic and maybe have some understanding of the teaching around the Catholic faith on homosexuality, they're going to notice right away that it's not typical for a Catholic priest to be out and to be open and honest about this part of his identity. And can you tell us, there is a sort of specific moment when that became more possible for you in a call, in a specific phone call that came? And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, the phone call came fairly late in that, but if you want to hear about the phone call.
Maybe starting with the phone call, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the phone call came in 2015, after maybe 20 years of my being in a little bit in the wilderness because of this issue.
Yes.
Since, as you mentioned, there are very few openly gay priests, but very many gay priests, which means that the priesthood in general is a huge closet. And that means that if you no one minds what you do, but if you say something, that's what gets the what's the word? It rattles the dovecot or whatever excuse my mixing my metaphors.
I'll think of an American version.
Whatever it is, ruffles the feathers. I don't know.
You're rattling the skeletons or in the closet.
Yes. Rattling the skeletons. That's probably a good one. So, I'd been in a, let's say, a liminal state in the life of the church, not really belonging to anything and not really doing to anything. But I was living in Sao Paulo at the time, in Brazil. And at that stage, the cardinal seems to have felt that it would be a good thing to try and get rid of me from the priesthood. Not for any particular reason, other than that I was celebrating Mass for LGBT people, trying to set up a kind of a mini pastoral in Sao Paulo. There wasn't anything being done, and Sao Paulo is a huge city. It's ridiculous that there's nothing of that sort. But he decided that he needed to try and get rid of me, so he wanted my consent to do that, which wasn't forthcoming. But then he managed to find a way that you can get rid of a priest, which was really dependent on an old piece of canon law, or maybe a newly revivified piece of canon law, allowing bishops to get rid of priests who maybe had left 30 years ago to get married and would never answer papers. So
they just didn't do the paperwork, and they never. How do you purge the files?
How do you purge the files? So basically, he wanted to do the file purging operation, even though I was there and could talk to him. So that wasn't what it was for. But anyhow, eventually, he pushed it through with his friends in the Roman Congregation for Clergy. Despite this process being one where they don't make a charge to you and they don't give you any right to defense, and you're not allowed to bring a canon lawyer. Anyhow, it's a pretty circular, in legal terms, it's a pretty circular process. What Pope Francis called self-referential, I think is the term. So I got this letter in Latin saying, you're not allowed to preach and teach or do anything. And that was pretty upsetting. Though I was told by a friend that if you get it in Latin, it means they don't really care whether you obey it or not.
Okay, that's an interesting.
If they really want you to obey it, they send it to you in the language they know.
To make sure you can read and understand.
Yes. If they send it to you
in Latin, okay, that's
lovely. It means, okay, we've done our stuff. It's a kind of a formality. But
now stay quiet, or we'll come after you again.
But anyhow, so I was pretty depressed about that, but I talked about it to my former novice master who had become a bishop in the north of Mexico, a man called Raúl Vera, Bishop of Saltillo in Mexico. He's now retired. And he had been close to Francis during Francis's period as Archbishop in Buenos Aires because they participated in Salam and things like that.
Yes.
And Raúl and Bergoglio had both been in the kind of oppressed minority of those who were pushing Vatican II and generally being more progressive at the time when the John Paul machinery was closing down on all of that. So I knew that Raúl knew him, but Raúl said to me, James, don't bother to write to him because the letter will never get through. I will seek a private audience with him and I will ask him to sort this out. So he sought a private audience. Eventually it was granted. He told me to write a letter. I wrote a letter, got it to him by hand so that he could hand it to the Holy Father. So he went and had his meeting with the Holy Father, and he rang me up a couple of days later and said it went very well. He didn't seem to be annoyed or upset that I'd asked him to sort this out. I told him all about you. And of course, Raúl had known me since I was a little grasshopper. So he could speak of me with some authority. Well, Raúl said something will happen. I don't know what, but something will happen. So then a couple of months later, I was sitting in Madrid and my phone rang and it said, Número oculto. I don't know what the US equivalent of that is. What does it say on phones?
Hidden number.
Hidden number, no ID, something like that.
No caller ID or something. It's the Spanish equivalent of that. But anyway, so I picked it up. Soy el Papa Francisco. ¿En serio? No, en broma, hijo.
En broma, hijo. I love that. I'm joking.
That's right. So this is Pope Francis. And I said, seriously?
But it's also I'm joking, son,
said,
which is the term of endearment
just joking,
in Spanish.
Son. Just kidding, son.
I love that.
Just kidding, son. But it was he. I could tell by the Argentinian accent and by the fact that he had my letter in front of him. And so he went through the letter and he made jokes about some of the people who I mentioned who were friends of his and things like that. And then he said, James, I want you to, should I say this in English or Spanish, which would be better?
And Spanish is fine, whatever.
Okay. He said, yo quiero que camines con plena libertad interior, siguiendo el Espíritu de Jesús. Y te doy el poder de las llaves. ¿Tú me entiendes? Te doy el poder de las llaves. So that's, I give you the power of the keys. Do you understand? I give you the power of the keys. Well, I didn't understand, but I knew that if the successor to Peter talks to you about keys, then it probably means something. I mean,
Cha-ching! You're in!
But he was clearly treating me as a priest, and he was clearly giving me some power.
Yes.
So later I found out from canon lawyer that the power of the keys traditionally refers to the power to preach and to hear confessions. And it's normally given to priests by their bishop. But what he was doing was giving me what is called universal jurisdiction.
Okay.
Which is something which he gave to the missionary priests in the Year of Mercy.
Yes.
And which he gives to cardinals. So now I'm very grand.
Wow. Okay.
But basically that means that I don't have to bother the frustrating task of trying to ask a bishop for permission to do what I do.
Well, and it's not exactly that he's your bishop.
It's not exactly that he's my bishop, but he's the universal ordinary.
He's everyone's in a way.
Exactly.
Yes.
But basically, I describe it as he set me free, but didn't tell me which bush to land in. He set me free to fly, but didn't say go land in the bush. So it's kind of, I can see that the old wineskins don't work here. Go and see whether you can find some new wineskin. That was my take.
So you went from one liminal space to a different liminal space.
But a liminal space in which I thought, okay.
Yes.
The machinery has thrown its full weight at me.
Yes.
And mysteriously the Pope has resurrected me.
Yes, protected you and
So it doesn't get better than that.
Lovely.
So I've been able to carry on doing what I was doing before, but now with an added sense of freedom that people who wanted to close me down have done the most that they can, and it hasn't worked.
Yeah. It just brings me so much joy to hear that story, and one of the pieces from what Pope Francis said to James that he didn't translate was about wanting him to go forth with this interior freedom,
complete interior freedom,
and that is, that's a spiritual gift.
following the Spirit of Jesus.
Yes.
So no, it was a very, well, obviously you don't forget that kind of conversation. And I asked Canon Law, I said, what does this mean in canonical terms? What does this mean? And he says, well, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, in canonical terms, it doesn't make any sense at all.
He's saying it as a Jesuit.
No, it wasn't.
No, I mean, in a sense of the interior freedom, a spiritual statement.
But the canonical thing doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But he said, but he does these things.
But he does these
so
things.
my guess is that I'm not the only person to whom the Pope has reached out and said, done something like that. And then, luckily, from my point of view, the next year, he told my novice master that that's what he'd done. So he deliberately created a witness.
Okay.
Not written, but oral.
Yes.
So that people couldn't say I'm making it up because he told, and he repeated to Raoul exactly the same words that I told you. So yes.
So there's nothing written that you
Not
know
as far
of.
as I know.
Okay.
Maybe he's written something and put it away.
Sorry, all these details are interesting to me. But
no,
yes.
But in one sense, what is there to write? Because he's done something as the, what's the word? The source of canon law that is not strictly speaking moldable into canon law. But there we are. Luckily, he's above it, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Wow. So, how have you flown, or like how have you used this interior freedom in terms of expanding your ministry and your ministerial expression and service?
Well, I guess that part of it has just enabled me to relax into quite how mainstream what I'm doing in this is. And that's the bizarre thing. People think, oh, an out gay priest must be really edgy. But in fact, I'm really quite a classical and conservative Catholic theologian, and people who hear my preaching and read me recognize that. The bizarre thing is that it's not accepted by precisely because of the openly gay element.
Yes.
Which is too silly for words.
Yes. It's like your theology is poor because
your theology, we can't even look at that because of the...
Okay.
But so it's
yes, that's a whole nother layer.
It's slightly crazy. But on the other hand, by this stage, there are so many people who know that the game is up as regards this world of double lives, which so characterizes the clerical milieu, that people now talk to me in a much more relaxed and friendly way, and treat me as part of things, and are less frightened. So that's been very, very good. But what it's meant in practical terms is, I'm able to go and visit groups in other places. Usually what happens is I have the good fortune to come somewhere like the United States, where very nice, rich, generous people invite me to give talks. And with that, I can then pay for trips to poor places where people couldn't invite me to give talks. So at this stage, I must have given retreats and weekends like in 9 of the provincial capitals of Mexico, in Costa Rica, in Colombia many times, in Peru, in Chile, in Brazil where I've lived, as well as lots of places all over Europe. And I really enjoy that, because these small groups, usually self-formed by young people, and quite a lot got going during the time of COVID. And they just want to be able to live their Christian faith as the LGBT people that they are. And at this stage, as young people, they're unable to work out why the hierarchy should be in such a, a hysterical state about all this. They quickly discover that it's because of the closet and all that. That's the reality. But so trying to help them, if you like, maintain their courage, not to be driven by resentment, not to allow their anger, which in many cases is justified, drive them out of the church. My first book in the subject was called Faith Beyond Resentment. And strangely enough, that comes time and time again, because you meet so many people who are resentful, not only on the gay issue, but for a whole lot of issues in the life of the church. So to be able to say, okay, let's remember this, that faith allows us to be taken into the new creation, which is not a reactive thing. If you're in reaction, you're allowing the evil that has been done to you to run you.
Amen.
You're letting the bastards get to you.
Yes. Oh, I love that. You have no idea how much I love that.
And that it's so important to be able to say, no, do not give these people free rental space in your head.
Yep.
Because that only does you harm. It doesn't do them any harm. They don't even notice, or they're giggling all the way to the bank, or whatever it is that they do. But once people realize this, they say, yes, it's true. I am a son of God. I'm a daughter of God. I'm able to grow. I'm able to appreciate Jesus through the Eucharist. We're able to share our life experiences. I'm not ashamed of who I am or where I'm coming from. This is something I find it really important, creating Eucharistic community in a place where Jesus, I know Jesus loves to be, because he's with people who are not ashamed of being sinners. And that's so rare in the Catholic setup, because everyone spends the whole time protecting themselves against their shame with kind of clerical formulas. This is one of the nice things about the LGBT world, is that we're pretty close to ground zero as regards shame. So I start in Spanish. Typically, my talks, it doesn't really work in English, but in Spanish I can see, hablando entre putos. This is a good way to start. And everyone is relaxed, because that's what we are, so that's fine. And the priest is no different from them. There is no, the whole question
We're talking as disciples.
Yes, what is it that Jesus is doing in our midst? And they begin to share stories, and the more people share, the more people grow, and it's very, very good. I've had, I remember once an aged Jesuit coming to visit one of those masses in Brazil, and afterwards he was just amazed. He said, I've been doing masses with young people for 50 years and never seen sharing like that. So I have the impression that these are the people, I call them, I say these are the confessors of the faith. Like the old term, the confessor, was people who had confessed the faith in the midst of the persecutions from the Roman Empire.
Yes, yeah.
And I said these are the people who are confessors of the faith in the midst of the persecution, which has come from church authority, not from the Roman Empire. Because they've held firm to it. They say we're not going to allow ourselves to be run out of the church. And I find that so encouraging, and particularly when so many other people are running away from it or just being too bored. And indeed, a lot of straight people just leave and go away because they know that the system is mistreating their gay and lesbian friends. That's one of the great things that you want to hammer into the heads of some of these bishops. It's the nobility of straight people who will not put up with how you are treating gay and lesbian people that is leaving your pews empty. The Pew Foundation shows exactly that.
Yeah.
The statistics show exactly that. And that's not just in this country, that's everywhere. So it seems to me to be, trying to, I think, what is the word in our second synodal process? Extend your tent, widen your tent. Do you remember the...
Which is it? The extend...
Well, in the second synodal, the key phrase for the second phase, the continental phase.
Expanding the tent.
Yes, widen your tent.
Yes, widening the tent.
Widen your tent, which is a quote from Isaiah.
Yeah.
So I'm busy widening the tent and trying to do that.
You are doing that.
I hope so.
And what you're doing too, it sounds like in these different experiences, is that you're making the tent safe. You're making the tent a safe space, which is what that other bishop or whatever couldn't ever see or create for himself in terms of a space where people can be open and honest and authentic about who they are and just bring their experience too.
Well, and for me, that's a great problem with our system, our clerical system as it stands, is that the shame around this area is so great that they can't deal with it. So how do we let them off the shame? I mean, it's easy enough to rub shame into people. The question is, how do you give people a soft landing? And that for me is the difficult one, because of course some of them are so, we all know this in a sense, the most virulently homophobic are always closeted gay men.
Of course.
They're there.
Of course.
And
yes.
Your country has plenty of high-ranking prelates who are, let us say, splendid examples of this.
Yes.
And some of those are too psychologically gone. I mean, only God can reach them with grace. But there are others who one hopes that one can gradually unfrighten. And I think that that's something that Pope Francis has done, and this whole synodal thing has done, is by encouraging people to talk about these things. He just makes the little phrases which open up conversation. And suddenly people are able to talk about what before was on eggshells. And with that, I think the significant number of clergy and bishops are gradually losing their fear that this is all going to blow up in their faces. I hope.
That's good to hear. As someone who had experience for 3 years, right, the nexus of the Vatican and the Obama administration, certainly you're completely aware of, it's not necessarily the closet, it's like the reverse, right? The room. The room is the closet, and the closet is like a few people. That's sort of just the reality that I experienced there. And at the same time, I've known many, I would say, like religious sisters and priests or lay people who are trained as maybe therapists or deep spiritual directors who have worked with clergy over time and throughout their lives to support them in addressing this and facing this. And so for me, it is encouraging to hear from you and your experience that you feel there is an opening to some conversation around this. Because you're right, how do you, and maybe as an ordained clergy, I don't know how much of your ministry is with other ordained men in the Catholic Church.
Not much. They tend to run to the hills.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Very few. I can talk to very, very few bishops and cardinals because very few bishops and cardinals are straight. The straight ones, ones are happy to talk to me because it doesn't, it's not their problem. But because they're in a minority, as you suggest, that does make conversation difficult. And the really difficult thing for clergy, curiously, is not even so much the bishops knowing or not knowing; it's the other clergy knowing.
Yeah.
Each one imagines, in a way that's simply not true, but they imagine that
they're the only one.
They're the only people who know. It's what a friend of mine called a honeycomb of closets. They know there are a lot of others, but no one really knows. So there's a genuine blindness as to what really is going on there. And I think that was one of the most striking things in that book by Frédéric Martel, which in English was called, I think, Power and Hypocrisy in the Vatican.
Yeah.
But in French and Italian and Spanish, it was just called Sodoma.
Yes, okay.
But he was invited by middle-ranking Monsignori into the Vatican. He was invited into the Vatican to look at this reality from within, knowing exactly who he was, a journalist who'd written on this subject before. They were basically, I think, saying, for God's sake, show everybody how this really works, so we don't have to carry on pretending any longer.
Yes.
Because I think for an older generation, the gilded closet was a kind of a perfect structure of cognitive dissonance. But I think the younger people they're so much more used to this reality outside them that the cognitive dissonance is unbearable.
They're feeling it. Yes.
Unbearable. So Frédéric wrote that book, but anecdotally, talking about your observation about the room and the closet.
Yeah.
When his book came out, one of his Monsignori from the Vatican estimated that 80% of those who worked in the Vatican were gay. And strangely, he got a phone call from Steve Bannon. Yes, that Steve Bannon.
Well, yeah.
That's Steve Bannon, who turned up in Paris.
I need something more than water in here. I think that's
That's Steve Bannon, who turned up in Paris and stayed in the Hotel Georges V. It was on some visit to, I don't know, sow chaos amongst Europeans. But anyhow, he'd read this book and he wanted to speak to Martel, its author. So he rang up Martel and said, would you come and have a drink with me? And Frédéric told me this. He said, would you come and have a drink with me? So Frédéric said, why not? I mean, the famous Steve Bannon, pourquoi non?
Yeah.
So he goes to Steve Bannon. So Bannon says, you say in your book, or rather your Monsignor says in your book, that 80% of the Monsignori in the Vatican are gay. So I rang up the Breitbart correspondent in Rome and I said, Martel says 80% are gay. Is this true? And he told me, no, Martel's got it completely wrong. It's 90%.
It's 90%. I love that. So, yes. Quizá. I don't know. Who knows, right? Like.
So
Wow.
it's kind of I don't know, secreto de Polichinello, I don't know how you say that in, an open secret, let's say.
Yes, an open secret.
And the more people can begin to
Yes.
treat it rationally
Yes.
rather than something that they need to hide from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
I'm curious, now you said this happened in 2015 that you got the call?
No,
Or-
I got the call in 2017.
2017.
2015 was the letter in
Oh,
Latin,
okay.
the letter in Latin.
So, have you noticed then since 2017, has there been any kind of noticeable people that have kind of followed that lead of being able to be more authentic to themselves and come out more honestly with it? Or is it still just kind of, even though there are things in place that are showing this is more accepted and this is more of a just acceptable part of humanity, are other people starting to pick up that?
Yes. But in leadership, it's difficult to tell.
Okay.
But I think that amongst ordinary clergy, yes, because they're all so fed up with
Okay.
the silly way of doing things. Except, of course, I'm afraid, for the very young, very conservative ones, who have only joined so as to inhabit that world,
Yes.
which is a worrying tendency. But I think that people are aware of it. Especially think of how many religious congregations run schools, and therefore they're dealing with people from the age of whatever it is, 6 to 18. Not to have a sensible and adult approach to this question just makes them bad educators. I mean, to try and insist on following a prioristic diocesan guides that tried to pretend that this isn't a real reality, that trans people aren't really trans people, that lesbian and gay people are in fact intrinsically heterosexual people who suffer from same-sex attraction and should be sent to have their... I mean, apart from the fact that it's now in increasing number of countries that's illegal, the fact is it defies common sense when the kids themselves know perfectly well who each other is and encourage each other and are usually very supportive amongst themselves. So anyone who runs an educational institution has an interest in learning how to talk truthfully so as to be able to educate truthfully. And that, I think that the issue is kind of running away with the authorities in that sense. And the key thing in this area is that Francis doesn't stamp down on people who say it's time to change the teaching. And that is inconceivable from the time of John Paul, when everything was forbidden. I mean, Ratzinger was slightly more open than John Paul. But now, I mean, the Cardinal Archbishop of Luxembourg, who's the relator of this synodal process, has said quite publicly, well, it's obvious that we have to, I mean, the teaching in this matter, which comes from the 2nd century, relies on basically an ancient science that is simply not scientific at all in our understanding. It was simply before we understood the basics of human biology. So, for a cardinal to be able to say that publicly and not immediately mass flight of the chickens. And so increasing number of people are able to say, even if it's only off the record, it's perfectly clear that they don't believe in it. The whole question is, how do you change this? How do you change those false definitions in the catechism? And here I think that Francis's approach is the right one. Of course, I would love him to change it tomorrow. But I think that he understands that if you just change definitions, all it does is create schism and division. People don't follow it. They just treat it as a new imposition. In the old Spanish imperial world, obedezco pero no cumplo was the phrase. You would receive the king's orders, but you wouldn't put them into practice. Which I think is actually much of how the US bishops have reacted to Francis's pontificate. But
how much time do we have here?
But I think he understands that this sort of issue, which is not really theologically a very difficult issue, is psychologically a difficult issue, and therefore it's in a change of relationships that it starts to become possible for people to change what they think. It's as you get to know people and feel relaxed about being with them. So I think his notion of synodality, which is essentially a horizontal movement within which conversations take place, that's the way we move on in this sphere, such that after a certain point it becomes evident that we change the definition because everybody is already on the new page, as it were.
Yes.
But it's going to take some time. I saw today that the Ugandan government has introduced the death penalty for homosexuality.
Yes.
So despite the Holy Father saying it shouldn't be criminalized, the Ugandan government, backed of course by strongly Christian, it must be said in this case, principally evangelical Christians, is now pursuing
and that's the issue of the illegality, and has been an area of the State Department. We've been working on this for years. We were working on this during our time between 2009 and 2012 to try to change that, and it's a huge challenge.
A huge challenge.
So given this sort of need for a broader approach, one of the things that I like to say about Wisdom Ways ourselves is that we're sort of, I always joke or say that religious communities like the Religious Sisters have a foot sort of inside the church and then a foot kind of outside the church. And so I like to say, well, we're kind of straddling that kind of outer foot and taking it another step out, right, in terms of expanding that tent. And in some ways, what I like to think about what we're doing in spaces for people who are of a variety of different faith traditions, and people who are not of any specific faith tradition, but are very deep people and loving people, that I sometimes think about Wisdom Ways as a school of love. And even thinking about what it would mean for the Catholic Church to just explore that question in a broader sense. How do we really teach love? How do we form young people in this? How do we grow ourselves in this? And it seems to me that has something to do with this sideways approach that you're referring to.
And but also it means that so-called teachers becoming aware that the Catholic thing is an adventure of discovery in which they are learners before they are teachers, instead of them trying to be teachers without having done the learning. And I'm afraid that that's what we get far too often. And that means that their so-called teaching is a series of a priori deductions from people who haven't gone through the hard work of finding out what it's about. And that's evidently part of learning, is a process of discovering what people are really like, what really is. Discovering that it's real that some people are non-binary, that it's real that some people are not the gender that they presented as at birth. So these things take a lot of work to discover what's really going on there. But simply saying, oh no, that can't be true, and we tell you authoritatively because we know. That was a model of the intellect as being able to shut down the unruly passions that was predominant, from the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the modern period, up until the middle of the 20th century. But we know enough
well,
now.
And even Augustine had his version of it.
Well, yes, but he was aware of the importance of relationality as well. But the key thing is the recognition that it's relationality that leads to rationality, not rationality that controls relationality. And for some people, that's quite a big shake-up, because that means moving outside an individualistic understanding towards a shared group moving on, which I think is very appropriate for us as Catholics. But for people who are used to the old way, it's quite, what's the word, destabilizing.
Well, because the old way, brings you up here, right? Brings you into the intellect, into words and thoughts and beliefs and creeds. And I have a history in ministry formation and graduate theological education and teaching as well. And one of the things I'll tell, in fact, the last group of younger seminarians that I was working with were from around the world. And I would say, fine, we spend a lot of time talking about faith and in the sense of cognitive belief. But what about trust, right? Which is much more. So I would help spend time with them unpacking what does it mean to trust in terms of the relationships of the people who are around you and the communities and churches, whatever, all the different types of communities and religious communities that you are a part of. Where is that informing your way of being and your way of being a disciple? And how are you reflecting on that and bringing that into your ministry?
I think precisely because faith is assumed to be a set of objective facts that you're supposed to know as if they were an ideology. When, in fact, as you say, the word for pistis, Greek, means persuasion. It means that someone else has persuaded you of their goodness and reliability, so that you do in fact know it, and therefore are able to relax into it, and therefore allow yourself to move forward in unseen worlds. But it's a movement from someone else to induct you into a disposition of relaxing because of trusting. And the trusting is because you know that they love you. But just think how uncerebral that is. Because it's relational.
But it's so much more real.
It's real.
And it's a soul truth, right?
Yes.
It's a soul reality. It's a soul truth. That's to me more real presence.
And it's a dynamic. It's a dynamic one because it's part of leading you on into something. Yes. No, I agree. I think that the importance of changing the psychology of the virtues in that sense. Instead of individual triumphs. I've got the idea now. I must hold on to it.
The concept. You're right.
I'm allowing myself to be taken into something by someone in whose presence I can relax because they like me.
And isn't that, as someone too who I offer spiritual care through spiritual direction and spiritual coaching, which is one of the few ways Catholic women can do this work. But that's what happens, right, in these safe spaces that you're creating, and it's a dynamic, it's a co-creation and a trust that develops and builds with the people that you're in ministry with.
In company,
Oh,
I entirely agree.
And those skills, so I'm curious, as someone who has the background too in ministry formation, you know, I'm someone who would try to teach those skills to people going into ministry. Is that something that you developed for yourself, or how did that sort of come about for you? I mean, maybe it came about in that first liminal space. I don't know.
I think very, very important for me was both the sense of impotence and of power not mine, because my first pastoral work and my first years training as priest and then as early as a priesthood were in the middle of the AIDS crisis, when AIDS was at its strongest. So before the retrovirals came along, at a time when I was living in Brazil, and 80% of people died within 5 months of their first opportunistic infection. So I did far more funerals in my first 2 or 3 years as a priest than I've done since. But that meant spending a lot of time with people in situations where there was nothing I could do. Where their presence gave things to me rather than me to them. Sometimes I was able to give them sacraments, and sometimes I was able to see the sacraments having quite extraordinary effects that were nothing to do with me. But the learning that it's that way around, that this is someone doing something for and through us rather than us doing things for that was a steep learning curve. But the Jesuits who taught me, they were very insistent on that. They made all the students, they said, we will not tolerate any student, they will not reach the exam, who does not have a pastoral ministry that is constantly reflected in their theological learning.
Nice.
In other words, you have to be reality-based.
Yes. Yes.
And that was extraordinarily good formation, and a real honour and a privilege to share very, very vulnerable life spaces with people at that time. But I also think that since then, also, by being in a liminal space, by not occupying an official space, I've got no bully pulpit. So I don't ever get close to people who actually want me there. And that's quite a good thing. That means, you know, for instance, where in the groups where I go, they're non-clerically.
They know who you are. They know what they're getting. Yes,
these are lay people.
Exactly.
These are lay people. They organise the thing, and the priests are nice extras who occasionally come in, but they're running the thing for their benefit. And I think that's the right way to do things. Because that means that it's not me turning up and thinking, okay, I'm sorry, you don't really know how to do this. I'd better tell you what to do.
Oh my goodness, yes. No.
Which so many people do. So I'm very glad of that powerlessness within the situation. We get on much better as a result of it.
Yeah.
And I take Nicholas the French Bulldog to mass as well. And
that's
so
wonderful.
people appreciate his presence as well.
But that is really a way where, I suppose the big term in the Catholic space would be sort of co-responsibility, but in this sense between the ordained and the not ordained. I tend to not even use the word lay so much because really it doesn't mean anything but not ordained. Yeah. And so you kind of make that point in a couple cases about being defined by the negative and how that's not really any definition of anything. So anyway, no, but what you're describing is the non-ordained owning, carrying, taking up, meeting their needs for each other mutually, and then saying, oh, it would help to have, Father James come and be with us.
Or a priest.
Or any priest, in this case you, but yeah.
The cardboard cutout du jour.
Yeah.
But no, I think you're right. I think that it's an important point to try and get across to people, which is that curiously in Christianity there's no such thing as a lay person.
Right.
Strictly speaking.
Right.
Strictly speaking, all of us are the high priest. Some of us are ordained as ministers of different sorts within that. But there's only one high priest, so it's an entirely priestly people. And curiously, in the old temple rite of the atonement, the difference was that with the lamb that was sacrificed, that the portions were only given to the priests, and the blood was sprinkled over the people as well, over the things. But of course, in our setup, because all of us are priests, we receive the portion as well as the blood. And people often don't realise how significant that is. It's a priest sharing amongst priests. That's the gesture of the sign. But I long for us to explore all that more fully, because this the whole male celibate thing is at this stage, such a disfiguration of the possibilities that we might have.
Right. But because the closet in the clergy is not only about sexual orientation, it's about sexuality, period, in many senses. Because I think, and you would know this, and maybe you've spoken about it in other places too, right? There's different senses of sexuality for the ordained in different geographical parts of our world, right? Whereas in many Latin American, South American countries, right, we know they all have families or multiple families or whatnot, right? So it's also just about whether or not the conversation is a broader conversation about love, but how do we bring our beings as sexual beings into reality, into part of this whole integration of who we are created to be as human persons. And bringing that glory of God, of the person fully alive, right, into all of these spaces in a way that's, again, healthy, honest.
Well, and I think when you say healthy and honest, for me the key thing, curiously, is not the sexual thing. It's the ability to talk.
To talk about, yeah.
It's the fact that part of the socialization process, whether in the predominantly gay clerical world in northern and western countries, or, for instance, and I've lived and taught in Bolivia. In Bolivia, amongst the diocesan clergy, well over 90%, closer to 99%, live in concubinage. This was since before the Spaniards came. I mean, the Aztecs, the Incas treated them the same way. So there is literally no expectation of a diocesan priestly candidate that they will remain celibate in any meaningful sense of the word. They will not, formally speaking, be married, but they can expect to live with a wife and have children. So, and this has been, But the rules of the game are none of this can be talked about. So just as it creates, the inability to talk about things creates a world in which everything is a bit of a lie. That's true regardless of the sexual orientation.
Yes, exactly. This is what,
And that is, that's the problem, is the fact that no one can tell the truth, because the one thing that they're, if you like, that might get in the way of them being ordained is to say something publicly about celibacy, that they're not going to keep it, because the whole game is you need publicly to proclaim that you're going to maintain this.
Yes.
Even if no one has the slightest expectation that you will
Yes.
in cultural reality.
Yeah.
And at this stage, that's so silly.
Yes.
Because there are people who want to be, who want to live by themselves, and there are people who want partnerships, and the people who want families. And it would be much, much better to stop and think, how are we going to find the people who are best suited to minister to the people of God and talk about this honestly? There's a very interesting book written by an Italian sociologist which came out recently, and he was a sociologist studying seminaries in the north of Italy, and the book is called in Italian La Casta dei Casti, the caste of the chaste. One of the things because he was interested to see how, if there were issues of child abuse and so forth.
Right.
And he said, no. He said the church doesn't produce predators, but it does produce liars.
Liars. Oh, yeah.
And that's the thing. Now, there would have been a time, many hundreds of years ago, when there would have
I've just had many high-ranking officials lie to my face straight out and find out years later. You know how that goes. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, but you know, and they do it.
Yes, it's real.
They do it very professionally without ever.
Oh, it's vomit-worthy. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and that seems to me to be something. It's the language. It's the ability to talk. And I understand that, up until 300 or 400 years ago, the notion was that there are these rules. They're out there. We're not going to look too closely at how well they're doing. Now get on and do good things. And in as far as people get on and do good things, it didn't matter. But since the end of the 19th century, with the invention of psychology and so forth, we talk about intimacy far more.
Yep.
It started with the beginning of the modern novel. It started with Cervantes. And then in the 19th century novel came more and more strongly, and with psychology more and more strongly. We can now talk about feelings, emotions, sexual relationships, etc., with a far, far more broadly and freely and without shame than before.
Yeah.
And yet the clerical structure of the church is utterly deprived of being
and we
able
could
to
maybe
talk.
even talk about reproduction. And maybe even talk about birth control, right? Because it's 95% of women, right, who are, depending on your stats again, who are using this, right?
Oh,
so
at least 95%.
Yeah.
But as you know, the ovary was discovered as recently as 1858.
Yes.
The menstrual cycle was discovered. The workings of the menstrual cycle was in 1870.
Yes.
In other words, just think what a long period of so-called traditional sexual morality was based on an entirely ignorant biology.
Yes. Yes.
And how difficult it is for everybody to get their heads around it. No.
And just completely 100% male-centered, right?
Yes,
As the deposit into the woman. Like the woman contributes nothing, right?
And indeed the woman was basically the defective version
of the male.
Of the male.
Right, which is another version of the teaching on homosexuality, right? Intrinsically disordered, a defective version of this, the defective version, right?
Defective heterosexual, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So it doesn't work, it doesn't convince anybody. On the other hand, they don't know how to move into the world of the talkable.
Yeah.
And I thought that actually Cardinal McElroy gave a very good attempt to begin to move into the realm of the talkable. But they've got to learn that. But the current structures of clerical formation are not, as far as I can see from its results, helping, because they're tending to tighten down into people reproducing ideology rather than.
Yes. And like you said, people are leaving. You know, the unutterable is there, and they're talking with their feet, and their time and attention.
And it's a great pity, and at this stage, it's quite unnecessary. But there we are. Once people start down a track, it's very difficult to turn turn the whole thing around a bit.
Yeah.
But there we are.
But it is a very, very deep problem, because it is the deceit and the hypocrisy and the lies. Like that's the core of some understanding. Some understandings of evil are more like it's a privation of the good or a lack of the good. whether or not this is something that's intentional or on purpose. It's certainly there, and it's not supportive, in my mind, of human growth and development and what, in fact, God wants for us as God's children.
Well, it's little lies that get you caught up in a corporative structure that then gives you a sense of belonging. And I'm afraid that that's the problem, because people suddenly find that who they are depends entirely on this thing.
Yeah.
And therefore, that if they start speaking out, they'll lose everything. And of course, that's not a healthy way to be in any enterprise.
So if I, and again, if there's something you don't want to talk about, that's fine. If we go back to that liminal space when you were sorting through your sexual preferences, at some period, what was it that, because I would imagine if there's a part of yourself that's hidden or not revealed in some way, how do you wonder, do they really love me? They don't know me. How?
Oh,
I mean,
on the contrary, you know you're an abomination. They can't possibly love you.
Yes.
You're an abomination.
Yes.
So you hide it.
Yes.
And then, in my case, that.
But then it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. You lock yourself up.
There's the logical fallacy even in it, and yeah.
Well, you lock yourself up and you become the perfect little boy. Mm-hmm. The best little boy in the world. That's a syndrome.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a best little girl in the world syndrome as well. But it's because you say, okay, they can't love me. I know I'm an abomination, therefore I will be the best little boy in the world. So basically, you're acting out. But at the root of it, there's an absolute lack of self-confidence. There's an absolute lack of being. Now, I had the good fortune, if you like, to fall through that at a relatively young age, like at age 18 or so, whereas others managed to survive not to fall through that until much later, when maybe it's too late in their life, because they would lose everything, literally, their livelihood and everything. I mean, so the result is depression and all sorts of other things instead. But yes, one of the things which I learned, there's a very good book which came out in the early 90s called Uncharted Lives. And I've forgotten the name of the author, but he was a marriage counsellor, and he and his wife gave marriage counselling until suddenly he came out and basically went off whatever rails there were to go off for about 10 years, but then came back this time as a couples counsellor, but as a gay couples counsellor. But what he studied and showed is how adolescence can never be completely suppressed. If you don't live it at the appropriate time, it will come and hit you.
Yes.
It's an inappropriate time. And it's enormously important, therefore, to enable people of relative orientations to live their adolescence.
Yes. For parents of teens.
Yes.
Listen.
Because if and this was the classic, gay thing, because you couldn't dare to have your adolescence. You realized age 12 or 13 that you were gay. You wouldn't dare to have your adolescence until you were in your mid-20s, when you might be able to afford to move away from home and running the risk of
and you create your own safe space, your own
safe space,
structure,
and then you could be a mad queen and charge around the streets of Chicago in short shorts and roller skates, and all of that. Looking like an absolute idiot, but maybe it's a necessary phase. But one of the things I really rejoice in seeing now is how many more kids are coming out and having their adolescences at the same time as their straight, because that seems so healthy. Because that means that the route towards getting all that over with and then being able to enter into more or less normal forms of courtship, in as far as there are any rituals of courtship left. But anyhow,
that's another live stream.
That's another one. But being able at least to learn how to relate to people with the possibility of forming couples. But that seems, that's a world that the whole ecclesiastical thing can't even begin to cope with for obvious reasons. So we get many priests who have never had an adolescence. And that's a very tragic reality.
Wow. I don't know, is there anything else that you feel like you just would like to add or emphasize, maybe especially for LGBT people who are listening or who might watch this recording later?
Well, the key thing for me, which I've discovered in all this, and the thing which I don't think this is only for LGBT people,
right.
but this is, I think, is something, is how important it is to understand that Jesus going up to his death for us was not so as to pay a price to satisfy some angry God, but was a sign of God entering into the space of our muck, our shame, our violence, occupying that space, not, as it were, with disgust at us, but because he likes us in the midst of all that. And so he occupies the place of shame. And occupying it means he detoxifies it for us, so that we find ourselves no longer put into fight or flight, or playing dead because of shame, but becoming able to hold our shame tenderly. And it's when you're able to hold shame tenderly that you're able to create relationships with other people who are like you without trying to. And that seems to be something which mainstream Christianity here in the States, as in my country, seems to have forgotten.
Yes.
It's become a doctrine of rules and cover-up.
Yep.
And the central mystery of it is someone occupying the place of shame so that we don't have to live like that. So we are no longer run by shame and therefore begin to be able to take responsibility for our various forms of screwed upness.
Yep.
Not because now you must behave, but because now you can discover what you're really about and where you might really find yourself doing something interesting.
And wouldn't it be great to have a pneumatology based on that, the work of the Holy Spirit based on that? That's to me what it.
Yes, that's exactly
would be.
So that's what I propose and what I'd like to leave with people is thinking of, if you think of Jesus in the Eucharist, what is Jesus doing? He's enabling the reenactment of that to be made alive for us, so that we can take it on board and become it as a body for other people. That seems an adventure worth pursuing.
Wow.
So that's.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having
really
me.
Appreciate your time and your openness and candor, and it's been a joy, and just really appreciate all of you who have been watching. And again, feel free to keep putting comments or questions in the chat, and we'll respond to you when things come up. And again, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we hope to be bringing you more amazing content in the near future.